I still remember the moment when the Proteus ship was shrunk and then injected straight into the human body in Fantastic Voyage. That scene made me shiver with fear. Through the window, giant red blood cells drift slowly like planets. Antibodies rush in like monsters, and the entire crew has only 1 hour to survive. If you watched this film many years ago, those images may still linger somewhere in your memory. But what few people know is behind that strange journey, there were also stories even harder to believe than the film itself. The legendary writer Isaac Asimov once read the script and said directly that it was very illogical, or the actors had to hang themselves on a wire that could break at any moment because it had been dipped in acid. Even a scene with Raquel Welch made the entire set stop because it was too sensitive. Today, let us explore 15 of the strangest and darkest facts behind Fantastic Voyage. 15. The sensitive antibody scene. Do you like the character? Dr. Cora Peterson, played by Raquel Welch. I do. With this character, the scene I always remember most is when the entire crew has to rush to pull off the giant antibodies that are clinging tightly to her suit in the deep red environment of the bloodstream in Fantastic Voyage. The cloudy white antibody masses cling to her body like living creatures, while the astronauts hurriedly tear them away before they crush the protective suit. That image is both tense and very unusual. But behind this scene was a situation that made the entire set fall into awkward silence. At first, director Richard Fleischer allowed the actors to freely remove the antibodies from any position on Cora's body so that the fight scene would look as natural as possible. However, when the cameras started rolling, all the male actors seemed to have exactly the same reaction. They removed antibodies from the shoulders, the arms, the sides, almost everywhere, but they deliberately avoided the chest area of Raquel Welch. The result was that on the screen, antibodies appeared densely across Cora's body, but one area was clearly almost untouched. Fleischer himself later recalled that the scene looked so strange that it resembled a Las Vegas showgirl standing on stage with sparkling decorations attached all over her body. A serious science fiction scene suddenly turned into a moment that made the entire film crew stop because it was too embarrassing. 14. The second take, even bolder. But the story with Raquel Welch did not stop there. After director Richard Fleischer realized the strange hesitation of the actors in the previous antibody removal scene, he immediately asked to reshoot the entire scene in Fantastic Voyage. Fleischer explained very clearly that if the antibodies were attached across the body of Dr. Cora Peterson, then the astronauts also had to remove them from every position so that the fight scene would look more realistic. However, the second take created a situation that was even more awkward. When the cameras started rolling again, the actors seemed determined to correct the mistake in a thorough way. They simultaneously reached towards the chest of Raquel Welch to remove the antibodies, which suddenly made the scene far more bold than the standards of Hollywood in the 1960s. In just a short moment, a serious science fiction scene turned into a moment that made the entire set fall silent because it was too sensitive. Fleischer quickly realized that if everything continued like that, the scene would go beyond the limit that cinema at that time could accept. In the end, he had to stop and stage every movement in very detailed ways, clearly assigning who would remove the antibodies from where and at what moment in order to control the scene before it went too far. 13. The character, Cora Peterson, was designed to emphasize sensual appeal. If you look back at the entire story in Fantastic Voyage, you will notice that the sensitive moments surrounding Cora Peterson do not seem to be something that happened by accident. From the beginning, this character was built in a very particular way. Dr. Cora Peterson is the only female member in the group of astronauts who are shrunk to enter the human body. Throughout that dangerous journey, the camera frequently shows close-ups of her more than any other character. not only in the scenes where the crew fights the antibodies, but also in tense moments inside the Proteus ship. The image of Cora Peterson is always placed in a prominent position. This happened exactly at the time when Raquel Welch was being heavily promoted by Hollywood as a new sensual symbol of the 1960s. In the same year, 1966, she created a major impact with the film 1,000,000 Years BC, where the image of Raquel Welch in a prehistoric costume quickly became one of the most famous posters in the history of cinema. After that success, the name of Welch almost exploded. And when people look back at Fantastic Voyage today, many believe that the script, giving a great deal of attention to the character Cora Peterson, was also part of the way Hollywood used the special appeal of an actress who was being seen as one of the most prominent sex symbols of the 1960s. 12. The Crow That Stole the Proteus Ship. If you still remember the tiny Proteus ship moving through giant streams of blood in Fantastic Voyage, you might think that such an important prop must have been protected very carefully. But sometimes, the strangest things happen right in the middle of a film set. To film the miniature scenes, the crew built two extremely small models of the Proteus ship, each only about 3 inches long. These models were used for close shots when the ship moved through arteries and veins. Because of their very small size, they were often placed right on work tables on the set for easy use. But one day, one of these models was placed near an open window. And then an unexpected guest appeared. A crow flew straight into the set, saw the small, shiny object on the table, and immediately grabbed it. In only a few seconds, the crow flew away, carrying the Proteus ship model with it. The entire film crew could only stand and watch in surprise. In the end, they had to build a new prop to continue filming while the stolen Proteus ship disappeared forever, in the literal sense, together with some crow somewhere outside in the sky of Los Angeles. 11. The swimming scene that almost caused an accident. When watching Fantastic Voyage again, you may remember the scenes where the astronauts leave the Proteus ship and swim through giant streams of blood. Everything looks as if they are truly floating in a dark red ocean inside the human body. But the truth behind it was far more dangerous than what we see on the screen. Those scenes were not filmed underwater at all. The actors were actually suspended on metal wires inside a dry soundstage. To create the feeling that they were swimming in a thick liquid like blood, the crew had them move slowly through the air while the cameras recorded every movement. The problem was that those metal wires reflected light very strongly under the studio lighting system. If left unchanged, the audience would see the wires immediately. So the film crew used a rather extreme method. They washed the wires with acid to make the metal surface rough so that the light would no longer reflect. But this process also made the wires significantly weaker. Throughout the filming, the actors had to hang in the air on wires that had been corroded by acid. And if one wire broke in the middle of a shot, they could fall straight down onto the studio floor from several meters above. 10. Filming 50% faster to simulate liquid. When I learned this information, I was very surprised, because even the way the astronauts move in Fantastic Voyage was a rather clever film technique of that time. If you look closely, their movement in the swimming scenes is always slow, heavy, and gives the feeling of being resisted by a thick liquid. This makes the audience believe that they are truly moving in blood. But the secret lies in the filming speed. The film crew recorded these scenes about 50% faster than normal. When played back at standard speed, every movement of the actors immediately became slower, softer, and heavier. As a result, on the screen, they look as if they are swimming in a dense environment, even though in reality, they were only hanging in the air inside the studio. That was one of the simple but effective techniques that Hollywood in the 1960s often used to turn science fiction ideas that were almost impossible to film into vivid images on the cinema screen. 9. The blood vortex from a champagne glass. There is a scene in Fantastic Voyage that still impresses me every time I watch it again. It is the moment when the Proteus ship is pulled into a violent vortex inside an artery. The blood spins like a dark red storm, dragging the tiny ship into chaotic circles. With the special effects of the 1960s, that image at the time truly made many people believe that the film crew had built an entire giant artery model. But the secret behind that scene was much smaller than what we imagine. To create the blood vortex effect, the film crew actually used only a giant champagne glass filled with water. This prop had originally been built for another film earlier, and it was brought out to be reused. When the water in the glass was stirred, the camera recorded the motion of the swirling liquid. On the screen, that tiny whirlpool immediately became a storm inside a blood vessel, powerful enough to pull the Proteus ship into the middle of the current. 8. The secret base was actually a stadium. Have you ever dreamed of owning a base as impressive as the secret research facility in Fantastic Voyage? A place with endless corridors, large laboratories, and advanced scientific equipment where impossible missions such as shrinking people and injecting them into a patient's body are prepared in absolute secrecy. When I first watched the film, I also thought that the film crew must have built a massive studio set to create that impressive space. But the truth was much simpler. Most of the scenes inside that secret base were actually filmed at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena. This is a large stadium, usually used for sports events and performances in Los Angeles. The film crew used the long corridors, backstage areas, and large interior spaces inside the stadium to transform it into a top-secret research center on the screen. Thanks to careful lighting, set design, and camera angles, the audience completely believed that it was a giant scientific base, not a stadium in the middle of the city. 7. Isaac Asimov criticized the script for many logical flaws. Do you remember the time when the name Isaac Asimov was almost synonymous with science fiction? There was a period when, if you walked into a bookstore in almost any city, you could see his books placed right on the most prominent shelves. For many sci-fi fans of that time, simply seeing the name Asimov on a book cover was enough to believe that the story inside must have a very serious scientific foundation. I used to think the same way. Because of that reputation, when Fantastic Voyage was being prepared for production, the studio approached Asimov and invited him to write a novel based on the film's script. The idea sounded perfect, an ambitious science fiction story combined with one of the most famous science writers in the world. But when Asimov read the script, his first reaction was quite direct. He commented that the story had quite a few logical flaws. For a writer who always tried to make the science in his stories as reasonable as possible, that was clearly a problem that was difficult to ignore. Some details in the journey of the Proteus ship, in his view, were simply not truly convincing from a scientific perspective. But the story did not end there. In the end, Asimov still agreed to write the novel. The reason was very simple. He was allowed to modify and adjust some details in the story to make it more reasonable. And when he began writing, he truly did exactly that. So if you have ever read the Fantastic Voyage novel and watched the film, you may notice that the book version carries the scientific influence of Asimov much more strongly than the original film script. 6. The book was released before the film. This is quite an interesting story that many people misunderstood for many years. To be honest with you, I also thought the same way before I looked into it more carefully. When Isaac Asimov began writing the novel for Fantastic Voyage, the production of the film encountered several delays. The filming and post-production stages lasted longer than expected. Meanwhile, Asimov was famous for his incredible writing speed. He could complete a book in the time that many other writers were still outlining their ideas. So in a relatively short period of time, the manuscript of the Fantastic Voyage novel was completed and sent to the publisher. The publisher did not wait for the film to be released in theatres. They decided to publish the book as soon as everything was ready. The result was a rather rare situation. The Fantastic Voyage novel appeared on bookstore shelves before the film officially premiered for audiences. This made many readers at that time believe that the film was adapted from Asimov's novel. That assumption was completely understandable because in the history of cinema, most famous films are adapted from books. But if you look back at the real history of the film, you will see that the truth is completely the opposite. That famous book was actually written based on the film's script, not the other way around. 5. The film was once used to teach medical students. I once believed that films were simply for entertainment. Science fiction films like Fantastic Voyage to me at that time were only strange adventures for audiences to imagine. Until I learned something quite surprising. In the 1980s, some medical schools actually showed excerpts from Fantastic Voyage in their classes. Not for entertainment, but to help students visualize the anatomy and physiology of the human body more clearly. Scenes of the Proteus ship moving through arteries, veins, or being attacked by the immune system were used to illustrate how antibodies react to foreign objects in the body. Of course, no one considered the film to be an accurate scientific document. But with its vivid images and bold imagination, Fantastic Voyage unintentionally became a rather interesting visual tool in medical classrooms of that time. 4. The journey inside the body lasts exactly 1 hour. How confident are you about how much you know about Fantastic Voyage? I once felt very confident that I remembered almost every detail of this film. The scenes of the Proteus ship drifting among giant blood cells, the antibodies rushing in like monsters, or the moment when the entire crew has to race against time. All of it seemed deeply imprinted in memory. But there was one thing that I only realized much later. In the story of the film, right after the Proteus ship and its crew are miniaturized and injected into the patient's body, they have exactly 1 hour to complete the mission. That is the maximum amount of time before the ship begins to return to its normal size. And if that happens while they are still inside the body, the result would almost certainly be a disaster. Because of that, their entire journey becomes a race against every minute and every second. The interesting part is most of that tense journey on screen also lasts almost exactly 1 hour of the film's runtime. In other words, the time inside the story and the time that you and I experience while watching the film nearly match each other. When the Proteus ship slips through giant arteries, drifts among enormous red blood cells, or when the entire crew panics because the clock is counting down, the clock in our real world is almost running at the same pace as theirs. That may be one of the reasons the film feels so tense and captivating even when you watch it again after many years. 3. 2 Oscars for breakthrough effects. If you and I went back to the 1960s, science fiction at that time was still not a genre that major awards frequently paid attention to. Yet Fantastic Voyage achieved something quite rare at that time. At the Academy Awards ceremony, the film won 2 Oscar statuettes for Best Special Effects and Best Art Direction Color. The scenes of gigantic blood vessels, floating blood cells, or antibodies attacking the Proteus ship were truly very bold images for cinema of the 1960s. Looking back today, those effects may have become familiar, but at the time the film was released, they were impressive enough to bring Fantastic Voyage onto the Oscar stage, something that not many science fiction films of that era managed to do. 2. A box office failure at the time of release. With achievements like those, who would think that a film that once won Oscars like Fantastic Voyage was at one time considered a financial loss? You did not hear that wrong. Today, when people mention Fantastic Voyage, many often remember the bold visual effects, the strange journey inside the human body, and the two Oscar statuettes the film won at the Academy Awards. But at the time the film was first released in 1966, the story behind the box office was not so bright. To break even, the film needed about $9.4 million. But in its initial release, the film's theatrical rental revenue reached only about $8.9 million. This number was lower than what was required, which caused the studio at that time to view the project as an unsuccessful financial investment. If you place yourself in the context of the 1960s, that can be somewhat understandable. The idea of shrinking people and injecting them into a patient's body to carry out a mission sounded both bold and a little crazy to many audiences at that time. Therefore, although the film had very impressive imagery and received attention from critics, its initial commercial success remained quite modest. Only many years later, when new generations of audiences continued to rediscover the film Fantastic Voyage, gradually began to be recognized for its true value. 1. From failure to a sci-fi legend. But perhaps the most interesting thing when looking back at the story of Fantastic Voyage is this. There are films that are released and immediately become a phenomenon. And there are also films that need many years for audiences to truly recognize their value. Fantastic Voyage clearly belongs to the second group. After leaving theaters, the film did not disappear. On the contrary, over time, more and more people began to look back at the strange journey of the Proteus ship and realize how bold its idea was for the cinema of the 1960s. Shrinking humans, sending them inside the body, turning blood vessel cells and the immune system into an entire world to explore. At that time, this was a science fiction idea that had almost never appeared on the big screen. Because of that, although it had a rather modest start at the box office, Fantastic Voyage gradually came to be regarded as one of the most creative sci-fi films of its era. And its influence did not stop in the 1960s. Many years later, the idea of shrinking humans to carry out a mission inside the body appeared again in other works, most notably Inner Space. Looking back today, it is interesting to think that a film once considered a commercial failure eventually became a science fiction legend, an adventure that many generations of audiences still remember. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.